Chapter 1, Part 3, The Empty Sickbay. The sickbay had been locked off, a part of its area for investigation of what might have happened. The green-looking figures were still shown on where it all happened. Sickbay is now a sterile crime scene with the faint, shifting yellow alert lights in the back. The security officers were carefully scanning the area, not specifically looking for blood, but for deeper scientific proof, molecular gaps. But the Romulan, the security chief, was just kneeling there, her eyes focused on figures in front of her as she was enchanted by them. Lieutenant? Tanara looked with a blank expression on her face to her side, seeing her junior officer standing there with a pad ready to be taken over. She reached out and took the pad from him as she looked at it. Standing slowly up from her kneeling position, she sighed and lowers the device. No reading, no skin cells, DNA, or even iron traces. Her voice carried a loaded frustration, unable to figure out how it was done. It went from perfect to smooth. Not for only that, Vane spoke, joining the investigation. Both areas seemed to be scrubbed to a molecular level. Taking a deep breath and placing his hands on his hips, he said, "It's not just clean, it's like the air molecular have been replaced in the transport room 1. Whoever did this, they are quite skilled, Lieutenant." The Romulan looked back at the two grainy figures. It didn't make sense. She never had to deal with something like this complex. Was she overlooking something? Was she taking the wrong steps to approach it? Perhaps taking a different point of view. Another sigh escaped Tanara braids as she turned to Vane. "Let's do that interview," she said, walking past him to continue the duty of trying to find out what happened and where their missing crew was right now. At interview room 020. "I'm telling you, Nurse Rosaline was there at the time when the blackout hit us." Celera slapped her hands flat on the table. "Why is no one believing what I'm saying right now? I'm not crazy." Tapping the table with his left hand finger, Ebony shrugged as he looked at the pad in his right hand. Nurse Rosaline was on deck 7, not at sickbay. Seeing the deck difference, not even close. Placing the pad down on the table and leaning a bit forward, "We are not saying you are crazy, but your story, our testimony, does not add up to the overall line of events." Leaning back in her chair, she reached out to her hair, trying to make sense of it all herself as she closed her eyes. "If you're suspecting that I did something to the chief, you are wrong. I actually looked forward to learning from her. I'm the bloody assistant chief medical officer." Celera spoke, opening her eyes and looking at Ebony, and then it hit her. "Her eyes," she mutters. Ebony blinked, looking a bit more puzzled at the sudden announcement. "Her eyes?" he echoed, nodding slowly. "Yeah, her eyes were soft green. I saw it from a distance when the blackout happened. They were green. I didn't think of it back then, as I was occupied planning out the next few steps of providing medical aid, but they were light green. I never saw that before." Celera acknowledged, in the lack of her own biological knowledge, to make out if something like that was natural or not. Ebony let out a sound of confirmation and uncertainty of what to do with this information. He stood up. "Thank you for your time, Ensign Ral. If there's anything else we need from you, we shall contact you." Celera shrugged, feeling as if this whole interview was a waste of time, but accepted it and stood up. "No, thank you for making time for my ranting and babbling." She gave him a nod. "Hope you find them soon, Lieutenant." With that, she walked out of the room to resume her duties, leaving the Assistant Chief of Security behind. Walking out of the room, Ebony glared in the direction of where Celera went. "Found anything useful?" He jumped up and looked at the other side, seeing Tanara standing there. "Lieutenant, don't do that." Ebony shrugged. "Not quite." She was pointing at Nurse Rosaline to have been there when the blackout happened, but she was a total different deck, eyewitnesses and everything. Ebony shrugged, looking back at the direction that was now empty, and raised a finger, looking back at his chief. But she mentioned that a nurse had like green eyes. Tanoa took the information and simply nodded after a while. Make a report and file it in. I need to test out some angles. With that, she turned around and walked away. Lab 143. The cracking sound of static go through the lab, but a faint cracking sound of footsteps were heard as a whooshing sound of what seems like a transporter was heard when the audio recording stopped. This ghost frequency is barely helping, Dara pointed out with frustration in her voice. What is it that it keeps popping up at the medical bay automatic recording? Play it again, the prince stated in a cold yet firm Vulcan voice. Her eyes focused on a single point in the room, a glass that had no significant meaning in this case, but it kept her eyes locked so she could focus on what she was hearing. Taking a deep breath, Dara pressed the button of the recording file. The sound would play again. The same thing was heard, as the prince shifted her head slightly and her brow frowned. The whooshing sound can be aligned with the transporter, but the pitch, that's wrong. It's colder and more mechanical by nature. Leaning at the table as Dara crossed her eyes, I scanned for any kind of mechanical species out there. Heck, even the obvious one, the Borg, was a zero on results. Shaking her head, this is something that the computer cannot even pinpoint either. Bridge. The crew had collected themselves at the bridge, as they wanted to share the findings of what they concluded was a perfect setup. Tanara and Ebony returned as they stood at attention near the console. Captain, Tanara spoke formally, we've concluded our investigation to no results. The interview collided with facts. The crime scene were, on a molecular level, scrubbed, and traces were nowhere to be found. We came to the same conclusion. The audio file we analyzed for the past hour got us stuck on what it originated from. T'Pren finished her report, noticing the frustration from Dara, who looked away. Viola looked at Valet to finish it up. Commander? Standing there with his arms crossed, he was using all the information that he read, heard and saw together as he noticed a beep coming from his console and looked at it. He hums for a second and looks back at his captain as he taps the console. Our sensors did not detect them because 142 seconds we lost in time were purged. But backlocking also did not detect it because it didn't alert it as an intruder, he concluded, and before anyone could ask, because these intruders were already part of the ship, or perhaps bigger, Starfleet. Taking a deep breath as Viola leans back in her chair, rubbing both her template. Shit, she muttered. Meaning? Sorrel looked over her shoulder to the other senior staff. Lowering her hands, Viola filled in the gaps, meaning that whatever took Dr. Sal and Lieutenant Zira was recognized by the computer as part of Starfleet. They had the keys to the gate and walked right into the backyard. Blinking a bit at the metaphor, Valette continued. I sent the data to Starbase 80. It appears that there are many displacements in many forms and locations. This, however, is even for Starbase 80 a disturbance that horrifies them. The data of the rapture that we are seeing is something they also scanned. What was the result? What are we dealing with? Tanara looked at her fellow Romulan. Looking once again to the data that came in, then back at them all. No. A word that had no meaning, but terrifying at the same time. I mean by that, they were unable to conclude what is happening in this universe. The data that was returned came back corrupt, as if affected by something. They warned us to treat this with utmost carefulness, and they gave us the quantum key to be able to use as their gate to come back to the Prime Universe. Viola looked at the screen, seeing the rift now smaller than a few hours ago, still beaming bright orange and yellow lights. If the search on the ship comes clean, with no clues of where my staff is, then we have to find out more about the other side of the rift. Yellow alert. Commander Davids, Commander Wren, work with Lieutenant Cyril on the ghost frequency. It might be the compass we need to find them. The bridge crew gets into motion as Vilo stares at the screen.